Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Equity is just and fair inclusion in a society where everybody can participate, prosper, thrive, and reach their full potential. I think that kind of utopic vision is within reach, and I can't think of a region that is better positioned to be the prototype for making it happen.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all. My name is Fred Blackwell, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for today's Commonwealth Club discussion. I'm the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, a community foundation serving the Bay Area and dedicated to ensuring that everyone in the Bay Area can get a good job, live in a safe and affordable home, and exercise their political voice. The San Francisco Foundation and our Bay Area leased donors are really pleased to be able to support this program and continue to do the work that we do with the Commonwealth Club to generate public discourse on a variety of important issues facing the Bay Area. And today we've got a juicy one, affordable housing. We have been hosting a series of conversations on this kind of issue and others. And if you want to see some of the previous panel discussions and discourse that we've been having, you can visit the Commonwealth Club website at www.commonwealthclub.org. And I will just get into today's program. We've got three presenters and speakers today that are going to be really great and I think bring a lot of good information. So I am not going to do a whole lot of framing of today's discussion because not only do we have a great set of panelists, but housing is an issue that for one reason or another touches us all in one way or another. And so I don't have to talk a whole lot about kind of what it's about, where we are. But I do want to say a few things. One is at the San Francisco Foundation, we have really been all in on housing, meaning that we have been using our grant making, our relationships, our platform that we provide for donors who are exercising philanthropy in the Bay Area and our voice to try to move the needle in a positive direction around housing issues because it's been such an acute issue. We feel that it is a really kind of central ingredient to achieving racial equity and economic inclusion in the region. But there are a couple of things I did want to just highlight really briefly that I think are important as we kind of head into this conversation. One is that, housing is not an issue that really conforms neatly into neighborhood, community, city boundaries, even county boundaries. It's a regional issue, and therefore we really think that we need to be thinking about and offering up regional solutions. So even though it kind of touches us in our respective communities, the solutions really, I think, are regional in nature, just like the problem is. The other thing that I would say is that this is also an issue that is intersectional, which means that, it's not kind of an issue that we experience in a siloed kind of way. If you're focused in on education or concerned about economic development or concerned about homelessness, those are housing issues. Housing issues sit at the center of that. And, no issue has been made even more clear to us than the intersection between housing and health over the last couple of years, when we are asking people to social distance or shelter in place. Those things are hard to do when you don't have a safe, stable, and affordable home. And so that's another thing that I think is important and that you'll see as a ingredient in all of the conversations we're having. But last, which I think is a good way to segue into the conversation we're about to have, is that we know how problematic it is. We know what kind of crisis we're in. We know when we look at kind of rents and trying to purchase homes, and we see the scale of the homelessness issues here in the Bay Area, that we've got a problem. And that problem is pretty intense for us in the Bay. It's actually more intense for us than some other regions in the country. The thing that's kind of optimistic, that makes me optimistic, at least though, about the Bay Area is that we have so many people working on solutions. And we do know some of the things that work. And we don't actually hear a lot about the solutions. So that's what we're focused in on today. And we've got three folks with us today that are focused on solutions, and I hope going to share a few things. First is Cindy Chavez, who is a Santa Clara County Supervisor. I'm not going to go into everybody's kind of bio in depth right now because I'm going to ask the speakers to say more about themselves and their organizations in a minute. But welcome, Cindy. Tamika Moss is CEO and founder of All Home, and she'll talk a little bit more about what All Home is about and what they are up to. Welcome, Tamika. And last but not least, welcome Dan Soslak, who is the Executive Director of Resources for Community Development. And he'll talk a lot more about the work that his organization does and what brings him to the work as well. But before I jump into the first question, just a reminder that we want to hear questions from you as well. And so I'll be kind of peppering these folks with questions, but I'll also be collecting questions from you all. So if you have a question for our guests or for me, please put it into the YouTube chat box and we will try our best to get to them in the latter part of the program. All right, so let's go, y'all. First question, and I guess I'll direct it to you, Tamika. Just talk a little bit about what your organization is about and what the work that you're doing, but also if you could share maybe a little bit of personal reflection on kind of what brings you to this work and why place is so important to you personally.
Well, thank you so much, Fred, for being our esteemed moderator. I'm so happy to be in the space with my colleagues to talk about this critical issue. So I come to this work really, in the video that sort of began this conversation, Fred, when you were talking about how it's critical for us to create opportunities for people to reach their full potential. And I actually got that message from my grandmother when I was a child, and how what she did, the sacrifices she made for my family, for my sisters and I, was about creating those opportunities for us. And so I grew up with that set of values, and it is manifested in a career of over 2 decades of fighting for housing and economic justice, both in the public sector as well as the nonprofit sector. So for me, it's such a foundational necessity to have safe and affordable homes for folks. But as you said, it's also foundational to every other aspect of people being able to thrive and live their full potential. So that's why it's so personally important to me. And with respect to All Home, we are an organization that is focused on regional solutions, as you first mentioned. I started this organization almost 4 years ago with the understanding that this issue of housing and housing insecurity, homelessness, economic security, all of those things are inextricably linked, and we can't solve them one community at a time. We actually have to be in partnership across our 9 counties, working with our cities, working with community-based organizations, in partnership with people with lived experience. So we really try to lift up solutions that work. We provide resources to efforts that are really proven solutions that are data informed. And we bring stakeholders across the entire spectrum of this ecosystem together to help us come up with strategies that can actually scale to the size of the challenge. And so I'm super excited to actually have a discussion focused on solutions, because the fact of the matter is we can spend so much of our time animating the problem because the problem is real. And yet we are not motivated to move forward if we're not focused on solutions. So I'm super excited to be in conversation today.
Thank you, Tamika. Dan, tell us a little bit about Resources for Community Development and what brings you to the work.
Sure. So thanks for having me. And Resources for Community Development, RCD. We look at this, we're the practitioners. We're a builder we're a nonprofit affordable housing developer. We also, operate the housing for many, many years. This is permanent housing. About 30% of our housing stock, which is at this point about 2,600 apartments in 5 different Bay Area counties, is supportive housing, which is housing that really is supporting folks coming from homelessness, people with special needs. So we have a deep history providing that housing, and also for many years operating it. We do 4 different things in our organization. We do real estate development component, which is, pretty interesting. And, that's how we produce more affordable housing. It's one way we do it. And I think it's really exciting that we've been able to produce much more. We have 1,500 apartments in our pipeline. And we can talk about, what's been great about that and what's been more challenging. I also think there's a lot of other solutions that are out there that are also pretty exciting right now. We also provide social services to our residents, really important to support folks once they're in the housing. We operate the housing for the long haul to make sure that it continues to be really sustainable and great for the residents and the community. And we also have a community development component of our organization that we started about 5 or 6 years ago, which aims to go beyond just the housing that we provide, but also provide support to the neighborhoods where our housing is located. And we've really done quite a lot of work in the Ashland Cherryland out of unincorporated part of Alameda County, with some great support from the county and the San Francisco Foundation to really try to move the bar on, not only housing needs, but other needs like healthcare and many other things. So we do that. I would just say, for me, I kind of got into this as a younger person. I grew up in Chicago, which, is kind of a, it's a really different environment, but I think as a city, and to kind of see how people and neighborhoods grow and change, and frankly, what's worked and what didn't work. I mean, Chicago has a tremendous, I think, negative history with housing in many ways. I mean, it's still a very segregated place. It's a place that we haven't really, I think in some ways, there were some mirrors to, frankly, some things that, we see here as well, but it's really different. And my first job when I was out of college was doing community organizing. I was able to meet some folks who were building community-based nonprofit housing. And this, I'm going to date myself, but it's pretty obvious. Like, this was in the 80s, and I had never, seen, I'd never heard of this stuff, and I just was like, wow, this is just amazing work. And the people that were doing it were compassionate and community-based. And, the housing they did was tremendous for the time. And, I just want to say that for me, there really is kind of a magic intersection of place and people when you're doing this. There's something about all of the different things that have to come together, the complexity of building, the complexity of working with the people who will live there, all of the different things that you need to do. That's pretty exciting. And it's something that's really kept me excited for, over 30 years.
Thank you, Dan. Supervisor, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Tell us about the county and tell us about how you got engaged in this. What motivates you?
Thank you. And Fred, thank you so much. And I'm excited to be having this conversation with the Commonwealth Club. So I am on the Board of Supervisors in Santa Clara County. And one of the challenges that we saw across the state of California is that when cities no longer had redevelopment monies, the question was, who's in charge of housing? And for most people, it was still, the cities are in charge of it. The problem is that as a county, we're responsible for mental health services, drug and alcohol counseling, medical services. We have one of the largest public health systems in the state. And what we realized is we could be as focused as we could on all of those services and still have people not thrive or succeed. And I just want everybody listening to imagine the situation for you if you were struggling with drug addiction or alcohol addiction and trying to recover from the street, and then we find you housing. We were doing it backwards. And then what happened for the county is that Destination Home, under the leadership of Jennifer Loving and my predecessors, did a cost study. And here's what we learned. We were spending a lot of money to keep it, essentially to support people in their homelessness, and not moving the dial in terms of ending human suffering or making sure that people really could thrive. And we know this primarily impacts low-income people of color, and we had an opportunity. And we can talk more about the solutions, but I'll just say that the county's approach has been partnership, leverage. Our goal is to build the permanent supportive housing that we don't have, to make sure we have interim housing for people as they're stabilizing until we can get them into that permanent housing. And then to keep people from becoming homeless in the first place. I mean, one of our ahas during COVID was that we were able to cobble together money from the public and private sector. We kept 20,000 families housed, 2/3 of them with children, 20,000. So, I'm just delighted to have this conversation. And I'll just wrap up with this point. I think we all could have a personal story. I just want to say that when I was growing up, I don't remember us having very long periods of time when someone wasn't living with us so that my parents could help them get on their feet and get into their own place. And what I learned from my parents much later was the reason that they did that, besides they were just rock solid people, is that that's how they got their start. And when we were little, and I didn't even remember it, and they paid it forward. And this is an opportunity for us to fundamentally change the future of our region if we can solve this problem, which I think we can.
Thank you, all three of you, for kind of sharing more about your personal journey, as well as kind of giving us a deeper sense of kind of the different corners that you're working from on this issue. I want to pivot now to start to talk about kind of some of the solution sides of thing. And I guess I'd start with the question, kind of what in this particular moment is giving you optimism? And is there something that you're working on right now that you're really excited about in terms of responding to this issue? And anybody can go. But I will pick someone.
Well, maybe I'll start. I think it is an incredible opportunity that this pandemic has sort of illuminated the challenges that so many low-income families and individuals have been experiencing for decades. Housing insecurity, homelessness, health challenges. And so it is really forced our policymakers and our communities to be much more responsive to the urgency of keeping people safe and alive. And I think out of that, we've seen unprecedented federal investment in making sure that people can stay housed through the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that was administered through the state of California into local communities. California sort of innovating with home key and room key, which for those of you who may not know, Project Room Key was really an interim housing solution that allowed people who were vulnerable to COVID to move into hotels and motels across the state to stabilize and receive support while at the height of the pandemic. And the Room Key program transitioned into Project Home Key, which was an effort to secure permanent housing, converting those hotels and motels. And I'm sure Dan can speak much more directly to this, and other types of dwellings, right? So that we can increase the amount of permanent supportive housing and interim housing that is needed for all of our neighbors who are outdoors. So I have been really encouraged to see the sort of innovations come from this crisis. I'd also say that what we need to do, though, is ensure that the red tape, the bureaucracy, all of the regulatory things that were relaxed during this crisis, like CEQA exemptions, expediting funding, having capital investments where our housing partners and others could actually build and rehab buildings quickly. All of that is a set of solutions that work. So we should be working to make those things permanent. And then the last thing I'd say is, All Home has been really engaged in this regional process with our Regional Impact Council to try to do a 75% reduction in unsheltered homelessness over the next 3 years. And we've had the incredible partnership of Supervisor Chavez and many other folks across this region who are really trying to figure out, how do we leverage our existing resources? How do we advocate for new resources and hold ourselves accountable for bringing our neighbors indoors as quickly as possible, but not compromising the other interventions of creating that permanent housing and preventing homelessness from happening in the first place? So I feel like the solution of doing those simultaneous investments, Fred, of prevention, interim housing, and permanent housing is an incredible opportunity that we have right now for the first time, I think, in decades, to see how far we can get on addressing this issue.
Thanks, Tamika. Dan, Supervisor?
And I thought that was an amazing answer, because there was just a ton there, and it's all right on. I mean, to me, there really is this kind of intersection now, and urgency is really what I kind of thought of as my first thinking of a word. I mean, I also think political will. I mean, the role of the state is just completely different now than it was in the last decade. I mean, we didn't really have very much housing support, either funding or really even from a policy perspective. I mean, the last governor, this wasn't his issue. And I think towards the very end, we finally began to have some housing legislation that was able to be passed. And that's really been incredible to see what the state's been able to roll out in this last 2 or 3 years with things like Home Key, that California Housing Accelerator, which is a program that sort of stuck affordable housing developments, has been, amazing. And, we have, 2 developments that are going to be able to move that were, stuck for a year because they couldn't get all their funding. So, I see that kind of thing. I also think political will, locally is just, to me, the politics are just completely different. I mean, it used to be that you really would go into a project and it would really be, how are we going to overcome, the backlash we're going to see? And I think that's obviously still a big issue in a lot of communities, but the support of local electeds and frankly, other folks in the community, really wasn't there 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And it kind of speaks to the urgency of the issue that, I think there's a real sense that we need to do something about housing and homelessness. It really affects everybody. I mean, the longer the more this goes on, you even if you're seemingly unaffected because you're maybe someone who owns a home and your housing costs are pretty stable, it's almost certainly someone in your family is going to be in this housing market. And if once they are, you get it. And so I think, I really do think there's been a great change and it's a great opportunity. I think, like Tamika said, we have to sustain. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest challenges I see is that, we've actually kind of taken advantage of a moment when there's budget surpluses in the state, there's federal money from COVID. That's not always the way it is. So how are we going to ensure that we can even sustain what we're building now and keep growing it? So
thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thanks. I'll jump in too and just add 2 points. One, I can't agree enough. I mean, Tamika's right, like this, and Dan's right. The state paying attention to this with money, like not just words, but with money, is fabulous. I think that makes a big difference. The other thing I'll just point out is that the private sector that is not housing is very interested in this topic. We raised $85 million, some of it public and some of it private, to keep those 20,000 families that I talked about housed. With Measure A, which is a housing bond that we passed here, we raised $950 million, but we've had $150 million matching funds to get 41 projects either built or in the pipeline. And that attention from the private sector we haven't seen. So there's a very high recognition that we need to get housing at all affordability levels. When I very first became an elected official, we talked about 2 types of affordable housing for seniors, and then market rate. Those were the 2 buttons you could push. And now the whole continuum is up for discussion and frankly for investment. Now, I want to see a ton more flexibility, because I think in locations that have programs that are built out, the more flexible the money is, the better. And I'd love it if someone said to us, your job is to build X and Y, hit these marks, and give us the money and let us do it, because we're moving as fast as we can. But we need more flexibility to be able to hit and really respond to the human suffering that we see on our streets.
Yeah. So thank you, you three. That there are a few things that I heard from you all. One was kind of this notion around the regulatory environment that Tamika was lifting up, the notion that we're starting to work more on kind of simultaneous investment. So not just kind of a silver bullet that's all about production or all about protection or all about preservation. The increased amount of political will at the state and the local level to move the right kinds of policies and programs forward, and the increased involvement from the private sector. Those are all really good ones. Let me ask this question as maybe a little bit of a follow-up. Are there levers out there that we know work and that we need to pull on a little bit harder? There's stuff that we need to be doing more of, maybe in those categories or others. And what else? What else should we be doing? What are the things that we should be doing that maybe we're not doing right now?
I'll start. One thing I would say is I cannot emphasize enough how critical it is that we get flexibility from the state so that we can make investments quickly on the ground. It's funny, when we look at the whole time for the development of housing, one of the biggest chunks is people waiting for tax credits. Like, I feel like that has just got to change like overnight in order for us to meet our goals. But the second thing that I would say is that with flexibility allows us to solve problems faster. So as an example, we did a cost study here, and it shows that if we have somebody living on the street, we spend $60,000 a year there to keep them on the street. When they're housed, even if they're seriously mentally ill, not only can we keep them housed over 3 years, like at a 90% rate, we're spending less than $40,000 a year on them. To keep a family from becoming homeless costs us $5,000. And if we give the family the flexibility and the agency to spend that money in a way that keeps their family intact, we don't see them again at a 95% rate over a year. So what I would just emphasize is that we have great opportunities and we need more flexibility. I want 100% accountability. I'm ready to be accountable, but flexibility from the state and federal government would make all the difference in the world, all the difference in the world.
So powerful, less expensive, and giving people more agency.
Let's do it.
Amen. Maybe I would just add a couple more, because that is a beautiful priority. And we also need permanent source of resources to actually support our sustained efforts. The supervisor referenced how redevelopment went away in 2012, which was our primary funding mechanism for deeply affordable housing across the state of California. And without a permanent source to provide both capital and operation supports to the developments that we're providing, rental assistance that is consistent, then we have to piecemeal our interventions together. And not only is that not timely, it's also not efficient, because in the interim, so many of our folks are falling into a crisis. When I was running Hamilton Families, one of the most profound realities that we had to contend with was that for every family that I was able to house, 3 more would become unhoused during the same period of time. So unless we really pay attention to that inflow, and, Cindy talked about the prevention costs. It is so inexpensive to keep someone from becoming homeless than it is to rehouse them once they've fallen into this crisis. And so it's both economical for us to have sustained ongoing resources, both at the state level, but also at the federal level. Fred, you know that the federal government before this administration has really gotten out of the business of providing cities and states with ongoing resources to address the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis. And those numbers correlate to increases across this entire nation in housing insecurity and homelessness. So I actually think all levels of government need to be involved. We need a permanent source that can sustain our efforts. And we also need to be disciplined about not moving to shiny objects, but focusing on the data-driven solutions that are actually working. And if we could do those things, y'all, we can actually solve this. But we have to believe that it's possible, because we've really only tried to maintain the crisis, and it is beyond maintenance. We actually have to get really courageous about solving it.
Thank you. Thanks, Tamika.
I think I would, double down on some of that, but a couple of new ones. I mean, one is just, I think we should really just focus on what's going well. I mean, there's some things that have happened. One for me is the idea of kind of land use reform and at least getting that down. I mean, SB 35, which was the bill that was passed 2 or 3 years ago, that entitled affordable housing as of right. I mean, my organization has gotten, 6 developments all over the Bay Area approved, saving a year or two through that law. I mean, that's a huge success, and we need to keep doing that. I know that's something that folks are looking at. Being really clear about inefficiencies in the system. I think that was mentioned already, and making some tough choices, but also, understanding that there's, some of it is built in. You won't be able to, because of accountability, you'll always have some bureaucracy. There are some things that cost more that I think are important to have, like things like prevailing wages on projects. I mean, that's pretty critical. I mean, those are the kinds of things. But that said, we also have a situation, for example, where, our state housing department is under one elected official, and our allocator of bonds and tax credits is under the treasurer, another elected official. So they have to spend lots of time figuring out how to work together. Their regulations are changing regularly. You should have that. That should be in one place. But, politically, that was hard to accomplish. So I think things like that, there are those things that are under our control, like land use laws and how government works, we really need to double down on, because there's other things like interest rates and the supply chain that are a lot harder for us to control, right? I mean, we're linked to the whole world economy. So I think that, and I also just one more, this whole regional idea that Fred, that you talked about in the beginning it's so important, because basically the way things are now, you're tied directly to your locality, and we have really enormous, differences in our cities and counties in this region. I mean, some of the places with the greatest needs really have the least amount of resources. They don't have the tax base. And this is whole counties. I mean, before some of the state funding and federal funding came in the last year or two, I mean, from what I could see, Contra Costa pretty much had the same federal funding that they've had for, 20 years, and it never really moved. I mean, that's what, that blew me away 20 years ago. It was like, how can we be planning for something that's an ongoing issue that the funding never, ever changes? And I think people did an amazing job of being efficient. And like the homelessness sector, I think, really became data driven, because they had to do more with less. And we need to have the abundance of the Bay Area be accessible to all of the Bay Area.
Thanks, Dan. Really good points. And maybe I'll stick with you, because you started to go down this road a little bit. So you all, what's in the way? What have been the barriers to actually getting these things done?
Yeah, I covered some of that. I mean, I thought about that question. I mean, it's money is obviously a big one. It's kind of a blasé answer, but I mean, I think one of the things that we really need to do is to figure out how to make this something that is, not just an annual budget kind of issue or a crisis issue, which I think it is a bit of both now. That's why the legislation, I think it's up at the state. I think there's even a hearing today to create a permanent source for affordable housing and homelessness. That would, I think, be a percentage of the annual state budget is really critical. I mean, you just need that to be able to sustain this. So, the other thing that, been thinking about is the whole idea that, you need a 2/3 vote to pass a housing bond in a community. And that's, it's an enormously high bar. I mean, I believe that we've had, votes where I think in Santa Rosa and San Jose, if I'm not mistaken, where, you've come in like, 60% and you lose. And that, I think that takes a state constitutional amendment to change. But, that is something that is just, critical to be able to have the tools to do. We sort of enter this a little bit with our hands behind our back. So I think, those kinds of things, which I know are being, actively pursued and worked on by a number of organizations and folks we all know, we just need to keep that up. And, it's like the supervisor Chavez said, I mean, when they took away redevelopment, at least that was a permanent source. And so I think that's one. And, I'm sure there's some others that other folks will name.
Cool. Thank you. Supervisor,
you want to go?
Well, I was actually, Dan, the point you raised, one of the last points you raised that I thought was so critical is the federal government in their lack of investment in the housing authorities has been a way really of killing opportunities for communities across the country. And so one thing I would say is as we are looking both to build out the permanent supportive housing, Section 8 vouchers are critical to sustaining and frankly, being able to upkeep and reinvest in these properties so that they stay healthy places for people to live is just critical. And I know that that is a significant challenge at the federal level, but I think it's worth all of us across the country with one voice saying, this is really important. Our local housing authority has been smart, helpful, flexible, and constrained. And they need the same flexibility that we're asking for. I would say one other thing, Fred, that as I think about the region, I think we have to figure out a way to have conversations region-wide about why it's important to build affordable housing in all of our communities. Because what I think is unfortunate is that we have these conversations with neighborhoods, one project at a time. And it's a terrible, terrible way to build community support and consciousness and a framework around what we're doing. And I think that is a regional, I don't think that can be done city by city. I think it should be done regionally. And the reason I think that's important is that, our successes are you can't see them anymore. When they work, no one knows that they have affordable housing on their street. It just gets integrated. Our failures are out in the community, exemplified by human suffering. That ability to communicate that we have a plan, here's how many people we've moved, here's what we're learning, here's what we're not doing anymore, and here's how we're going to get people the housing and the services they need, and keeping that in a very real time where the community can be engaged is so needed. And I think that can only be done regionally.
Thank you. Tamika.
Absolutely. I guess I would just add maybe some context for the sort of structural nature of these challenges. I think it's really easy for people who experience homelessness in their communities to want to understand the individual's challenges, whether or not they have, mental health or substance abuse challenges, health concerns. But the fact of the matter is, homelessness is a manifestation of systemic failures in our community. The homelessness is first and foremost a housing crisis. It is reflected by the disproportionate number of folks experiencing this crisis who are Black and brown because of structural racism, because communities weren't able to access housing options and wealth building opportunities over the inception of this country. And so I think when we are trying to solve systemic problems with programmatic interventions, we're missing the mark. So we have to be able as a society to hold both spaces. We need emergency action for people for our brothers and sisters who are outdoors right now. But unless we deal with the upstream systemic issues of the over 1 million people who are earning less than $35,000 a year in this region, where housing costs are 10 times that, that math problem will continue to explode and make this region untenable for millions of people. And so I think it's important for us to hold the space that homelessness and housing insecurity, as well as our economic insecurity, are all related. And unless we're looking at those root causes, we're not going to be solving the right set of challenges. And I think it's been really helpful for us to be able to integrate our understanding of the structural barriers and take action toward the solutions that we know will address those.
Supervisor, one of the things that you kind of listed off when you talked about the need to be kind of crisper and better at communicating what the plan is, you talked about a component of that being taking inventory of what we learned. So what have we learned, y'all? We've been pushing a lot of stuff out there. I mean, obviously there's some stuff that's worked, some stuff that hasn't worked. What are we learning? And what do you all think is important to share with the audience around what we've learned?
I'll jump in and start by saying, I think that we absolutely have to focus on prevention. And one of the reasons is that what I see us doing is moving firmly and quickly to house people in our community. But without preventing homelessness, we're never going to get ahead of it. And as an example, we know in Santa Clara County that every year 600 families become homeless, families with children, 600 every year. So as we focus on that group, on veterans, on transitional aged youth, we're really trying to understand how is it that we do the interventions so that we don't have 600 families with children on the streets every year. We're going to end family homelessness in our county by 2025. But the fact of the matter is, it's going to take us till 2025 to stop families from becoming homeless in the first place. So I think what we've learned is that it's not one answer, that we have to move on all fronts very quickly, that we have to learn while we're doing, be able to demonstrate what we're learning, and then we have to be able to show the numbers. This is how many people we've housed using this model. This is how many of them have stayed housed. Here's what the delta is. Because I think the more we can do that, the better we're going to be able to engage the community here who voted at a 2/3 level for a housing bond. And Dan, I counted every vote. I was so waiting. I mean, we didn't know for weeks if we were going to make it. But also the private sector and our neighborhoods. Like, people will buy in if we can show them that we're really able to move the dial. And it's really hard to do that, but I think we absolutely have to.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll chime in with a couple things as well. I think one of the things that we've learned is that alignment and coordination with strategies and solutions work. You've heard the supervisor talk about the incredible work that the county has done. That's because Santa Clara County, as a regional organization, represents some of the most strategic alignment and coordination around ending this crisis than we do in any of our other counties. And it took them decades to kind of get all of the stakeholders around the table working in the same direction, figuring out how to problem solve in real time. We need that in every community across the region. So that those words are not just words. It actually matters when we, break down the silos, get around the table, bring each of those assets, housing authorities, county resources, city resources, strategy, the whole 9 yards to the table, and think about solutions. The other thing that I think we've learned is what Dan mentioned, which is we need regional infrastructure to help us meet our goals. So the development of the Bay Area Financing and Housing and Financing Authority, or BAFA, tremendous, right? Under the leadership of Assemblymember Chu, to create a housing and financing authority that allows us to aggregate resources, to create strategy and policy across our 9 counties, to really think about our affordability crisis as well as our homelessness crisis. That right there breaks down the silos of dollars being tied to any one county and putting those resources in a coordinated fashion so that we can actually have some economies of scale. So I've been very encouraged by that. And then the last thing I'd say is public-private partnerships work. I mean, we have really been able to leverage resources from philanthropy, from the private sector, in partnership with the public sector to scale some of these solutions that we see working. And so that has been a really encouraging design in how we're tackling this challenge.
Fabulous. Dan.
I think I'll maybe riff off some maybe it will be ripping off some other comments from the supervisor and Tamika. But, I thought the income comment that Tamika made was really important because, it's not, it is a housing crisis, but it's also an income crisis because people, I remember doing some interviews and talking with some of our residents, and you could see that maybe though their housing kind of crisis or their housing situation was stable, they really had an income crisis. They needed to have transportation, they needed to have access to food. And there were so many things that, frankly, if you are able to get a job that gives you benefits and other types of things, housing could be a platform for that. That's great. But I also think that, when we have income inequality, that's something that we should also focus on. And I also think it kind of goes to the private sector piece because, I have young relatives who are, couples where both of them are working, they're in their 30s. They're looking for cheaper housing markets to move to. And I worry and I wonder how private business can basically sustain a situation where a whole generation is basically saying, I can't afford to live here. And that's not even the people we've been mostly talking about who really have challenges because they're low or very low income. So I think that's a really good reason why, business needs to be at the table here because I think they are to some extent, but I certainly, see it in our organization, and it's discouraging, I think, for everybody. And so I think that's something that I've certainly learned. And then I think just sort of professionally, staying really nimble, because we're in a business where things are really changing a lot and we're responsive to things that are happening. We're taking more people who are unhoused into our buildings than we ever have. And it's creating a different type of environment because those people are living with families or they're living with elders who, haven't had that experience before. What's that like? The funding, I mentioned the supply chain. I kind of laugh a little bit when I think about COVID, because when COVID started, we thought, we were going to have a really challenging health situation with our residents, which we were, thank goodness, able to avoid. And I think affordable homes where people have their own apartment really, is incredibly important in that situation. We thought our residents weren't going to be able to pay rent, and we had that to some extent, but it didn't really stop us. We were able, most of them were able to pay. But we also thought that, and so that's good, but we also thought that, hey, real estate prices were going to tank so we could buy lots of sites. We also thought, hey, the construction market's going to tank because no one will be building, and then we're going to save lots of money and crank up our production. So, how do you figure all that stuff out? And, maybe we were just crummy prognosticators, but I think that is so interesting and a big challenge. And you just have to learn that you are going to have to, you're going to be presented with challenges, and you're going to need to experiment, do some things differently, and keep learning.
Cool. I want to bring a couple of questions from some of the listeners into the mix here. And the first one I want to bring in has to do with ADUs. You all remember, like a couple of legislative cycles ago, whether it was in Sacramento or at the local level, there was this kind of flurry of policy activity. And for those who don't know, ADUs, accessory dwelling units, which basically allow people to put a second unit on a lot that's maybe zoned for single family homes. So one question there is like, is that a viable strategy? Two is, since that was a couple of years ago, what's the status? How's it working?
I think it's a viable strategy. I just don't know how much of an affordability strategy it is. I mean, I see it as I think it probably is working pretty well. I don't have the statistics on that. I mean, just anecdotally, where I live, in South Berkeley, people are building them, and they're pretty impressive. They're like right up to the lot line. I think they're adding units. I'm guessing that there's a whole business around this, and that when we do get data, we're going to see that a lot of housing was built, and I think that's great. I think we need as much housing as we can get. So I'm all for it. And I think it's a good use of people's space, which, I would rather not, have grass in their backyards. They can build a unit. That said, I don't know that it reaches necessarily some of the people we really want to serve, but I think it can be a really important strategy. And be interested, what my fellow panelists would say about it.
Yeah, I would just say that I think while we're focused very much on the neediest in our community, that we have to recognize that we have a housing crisis in the state. And that means that we need to move on all fronts. One of the things that I think is very interesting about ADUs is one, they're becoming more affordable, which I think they weren't at first. And there are whole industries that are popping up around being able to supply ADUs. I know the city of San Jose and many other cities are fast tracking their permitting process to try to bring down the cost of ADUs. So I think that's all to the good. And I also think, honestly, it can help free up home space for families that, where you have a senior or two living in a home that don't need their big home, that are comfortable living in back and renting their home to a growing family. I mean, I think it adds flexibility to the market, which we absolutely need flexibility. And one last thing I'll say, there is no silver bullet. And what that means is that we're moving on all fronts all the time with the most effective strategies we can to build along the continuum.
Thank you. Tamika, anything to add?
I would just say that there continues to be a great deal of interest in ADUs. I know the Bay Area Council has been working on legislation for the last 4 years to make it easier and more affordable for people to use to access ADUs, especially low-income homeowners, where that can be a wealth building opportunity for them to stay in their homes, as well as create more living space for family members. But I think Dan is right. It's not necessarily a tool that's going to bring extremely low-income folks necessarily into these housing opportunities, and we need more along the continuum. So All Home has been really supportive of ADU development and trying to figure out the policy implications for making it easier to finance them. I know there's also a lot of modular construction, pop-ups now trying to do ADUs. All of that is good. We need it faster, we need more of it, and we need it accessible across the economic spectrum. So I'm all for that.
Thank you. One of the things that you hear folks talk a lot about, and it's been mentioned several times on this panel, is the need to develop new housing at all levels of affordability. I think one of the questions that I had from a listener, though, is how do we prevent that from being reduced down to a trickle-down approach to housing, where we're just trying to develop more market rate housing and hope that that takes the pressure downstream off in the market?
Well, the listener is obviously seeing the trend lines over the last 30 years across the Bay Area, where we have built much more market rate housing than we have housing for people with extremely low incomes. And that's part of why we are advancing a piece of legislation, 2094, to require that the regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA, doesn't currently require jurisdictions to report on how much housing they're producing for extremely low income households. And so we are advancing a piece of legislation to require that, so that in that report, jurisdictions can actually look at, okay, we've done this level of affordability, we've done this level, and this is how much ELI housing we've produced. If we don't have those kinds of checks and balances in our system, the market does dictate how much housing gets built. If you don't have deep subsidies in your community or local measures like Measure A in Santa Clara County and others across the region, you don't have the resources to do the deeply affordable housing that we've been talking about all hour. So we need to make that a policy and political priority in order to ensure that we're getting enough of that production across the region.
Anything else?
Yeah, I would I don't think it's great if cities focus, on sort of supporting, a higher level of income of housing. But I think it is a need, I mean, there's this whole level of, because we're basically, I mean, the highest income that we can ever really produce is 80% of area median, which is, I forget how much that is. It's probably 70, 80,000 or something like that for a family, which is, there are many, many people who are out there in communities who are, working people, teacher housing, which I think it's kind of pretty great that school districts are kind of taking that on. I mean, I kind of go back to employers. It feel, to me, people are, employers are employing a lot of people who literally can't afford the rent. I mean, it's great if you pay people a good income, but if you have a job and you can't afford the rent, it's a big challenge. So I do think this kind of 80 to 120% of median level, I understand why people really are interested in it. It's pretty hard to produce because there's no direct funding source, or I think there's a state program, but it's pretty limited. And I think it's something that we want to look at. But I also totally agree that it's very, very hard to produce housing for people at the lowest end, and I certainly would think that's where the emphasis should be.
I would only add two thoughts to this. One is that I think the idea that trickle down, it's almost like we'll build market rate or luxury housing, and eventually it'll become, we'll either have enough housing so everybody's going to be okay, or it'll become unappealing and then it'll be available to lower income communities. I mean, that's really what people are saying. And I think we have to just be honest that we don't build housing at every affordability level, and we need to, period. And so that's kind of one thought. The second thought that I have is that, one debate that we're having in our community is, are we spending too much a door for low income housing? And it begs two questions. One is, does a lower income person deserve less? So I think that's one issue. I think the second issue is, and I think this is worth us thinking about, is what are all the ways that we can reduce cost? And one of them is speed, because the trade-off is always, what I hear is, well, if we weren't paying prevailing wage, the housing would be so much less expensive. And the fact of the matter is that it's the low wages that have people not be able to afford where they live. And in Santa Clara County right now, the average rent is for an apartment is $3,000. So, whenever we want to look at how to reduce cost, we have to think about what are the big problems we're trying to solve. And the big problem we're trying to solve is creating an environment that's affordable for everyone to live in, whether you are a CEO or the childcare provider for that CEO.
Yeah, thank you. A few more questions here. One you will love, this first one you will love. How do we solve for the ever-present NIMBYers?
Oh, goodness. It's a perennial question. I think the supervisor spoke to this earlier, and I'll just sort of double down on it. We don't have the luxury anymore of deciding how exclusive or not inclusive our communities can be. I feel like that is a paradigm that no longer serves the majority of the communities in the Bay Area, right? Where everybody was like, oh, I got Gates, I can afford it. You can't, sorry for you, right? Like The crisis that we're experiencing is not just happening for our most vulnerable neighbors. It's happening for the businesses who can't afford to pay their workers living wages, whose children can't afford to live here once they go away to college and come back and there's no housing available because it's $3,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment. So NIMBYism, I think, has to be confronted with courageous reality checks from every member of our community that's saying, look, you don't want a homelessness problem on your block or in your community. The way you solve for that is to make sure there's housing for those folks. So anytime a housing development is proposed, we need to embrace that, no matter what neighborhood, no matter what city, no matter what county, because we are not going to be able to address the human suffering and the societal ail that is this crisis without saying yes to housing. So I think we have to just change the paradigm, Fred. NIMBYism will always be there, but they can't be the loudest voices in the room when this issue is actually a challenge for everyone in the Bay Area, no matter what your financial or housing position is.
Thank you.
Dan, did you want to jump in? Or go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think sort of, maybe at the project or tactical level, I mean, we really do, we do what we always do, which is really try to be responsive and clear about what we're doing and respond to the community. If there are folks in the community who want to be involved after the building is completed, we'll do that. But, I do think that also this is slowly changing. I sort of feel like the appropriateness of being in NIMBY is not what it was before. I think there really is this sort of sense of, YIMBY. And also it's just, I hope I'm not dreaming this, but I think there really is a sense that, of people that maybe it's not the right thing to do. And I know that when it comes to people's neighborhood, that often doesn't, play out. But that is something I'm a little more optimistic about than I was if you'd asked me 15 years ago.
And I'll chime in here. I'll tell you what I think. I think we have to have buildings that are beautifully designed, that respect the neighborhoods they're in, that we keep our word, that they're run really well. And the reason that's important is that, frankly, I in my time in public office, almost every project, whether it has been market rate or affordable, has had opposition. And that's because, frankly, in the past, we don't always live up to what we tell neighbors are going to come into their communities. If it's new buildings should fit into neighborhood character, we should spend money on design. We should have a phone number that people can call during construction and when it's operating, that if there are challenges, they can call. And the better job we do, and by the way, again, I'm going to say this for all affordability levels. When I first got on the city council, I had a development that when it came out of the ground didn't look like what the developers told the community was going to look like. And it was painted a color that could only be described as offensive. This neighborhood said yes to the project before it was being built. And afterwards, they became NIMBYs. They weren't NIMBYs. We made them NIMBYs. So I think we have to not surprise people. We have to engage them in a meaningful way. And we've got to knock it out of the park. And we should be doing that across the affordability spectrum. This is not just about affordable housing. It's about making neighborhoods great and making people not afraid of their neighbors. I mean, sometimes we do that and we can do better.
So Mika, you started to go down this road for a second when you talked about how Black and Brown communities have been disproportionately impacted by the crisis that we're experiencing around housing and homelessness. The listeners are asking kind of everybody to really talk a little bit about what are your thoughts on the root causes of homelessness, and are we doing enough to be responsive to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I said a bit ago, it is not accidental that there is an overrepresentation of Black and Brown people experiencing this crisis because of the structure, the racist housing policies that still permeate the way in which we build housing, the way in which we do land use, and those are those implications and covenants are still affecting how, in fact, people are housed today. So, as the supervisor was just saying, like, we need beautiful buildings, we need great design and so forth. But I think the other thing we need to challenge is the classism and racism that undergirds this fear, right? Mm-hmm. That you need to be afraid of your neighbor because they're poor, because they have been unhoused. You know what I'm saying? Like, the fact of the matter is people get sicker and more ill and more vulnerable when they are unhoused. And when they are housed, they get healthier, they become community partners, they have much more bandwidth to be active community members. And so to me, we can't keep setting aside the racialized nature of this crisis as if we can solve it without confronting it. And I'll just give you a very specific example, Fred. In the city and county of San Francisco, the average median income for African Americans in the city and county of San Francisco is $30,000 a year. What housing, even if you are working multiple jobs, you're doing all the things that society says you're supposed to do in terms of your self-sufficiency and caring for your family, what in the world are you going to do with $30,000 a year in this housing market? So that's when I talk about sort of the poverty of homelessness and housing insecurity and how that is hyperly racialized. And unless we look at how, in fact, are the interventions that we're proposing taking into account the cultural conditions, right, that Black and Brown community members are experiencing, and not just like listening, but changing the way that we administer those programs and those policies that actually reduce the disparities. So again, talking about it isn't enough. We actually have to take action around intentionally dismantling that historic systemic challenge that this housing market was built on, frankly.
I want to add something. I think Tamika is absolutely right. And I just want to add a perspective. Often I hear people say, if we could just make sure that everybody graduated from high school, this disparity would go away. And, we have a school in a school district in Palo Alto that spends $22,000 per child per year in their school. I could pick a school district on the east side of San Jose that is $12,000 a year. And the resource problem isn't just in the classroom, but then there's the community resource problem, right? That child not only has a $22,000 investment in them, they have a summer filled with activities and camps and learning opportunities. And the kids that I represent don't have nearly any of that, right? The programs that they are able to go to are programs that they can afford. And often we're looking at children who are in environments that frankly don't have a learning environment to them. So I think what we have to really recognize is that what we're talking about is fundamentally changing everything, because we've been doing it wrong for so long that we don't even see the gaps. And, I'll just wrap up with this point that I was talking to somebody who I respect very much, who said to me, you have got to just make sure children stay in school. And I was thinking about this 22,000, 12,000 number. And then I thought, what would it actually take to level that playing field? And we're probably talking about $30,000 a child in the schools that I represent just to break even. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Cindy, to that point, that someone much smarter than me once said, racism is the water, not the shark. It is what we consume. It is how we think. It is the context in which we live. So to confront that is, as you said, it is everything.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think the comment about it sort of being pervasive and kind of what we're built on. It's so true because basically this is again, housing is one symptom. It is all intersectional. There's health, there's jobs. This is something that we, in some ways, we're sort of reaping what happens when you build an economy, but you don't build it for everybody. Yeah. And I think that's something we really have to look at really hard and say, what are we going to do beyond, trying to really kind of handle an emergency? Where are we going where we can turn this around?
Yeah. Thank you, y'all. I could talk to you all about this subject all afternoon long, but I want to end with a real important question here. If you're not an elected leader or someone who works in the housing industry or in a nonprofit that's constantly responsive to this, and you're just an ordinary person who's concerned about this issue, what should I be doing? Like, for the lay person who's just trying to say, like, how can I be a part of the solution? What should I be doing?
I'll jump in and maybe a little unorthodox, but one is, think about having a career in housing or homelessness. I mean, we need people. We are, for good or bad, kind of a growing sector, I think, right now. And I think there's a lot of opportunity and need. And, I think you can really do a lot of good in the world and support people's lives. So I think that's one. I mean, the other one is a little out there, but, I would just say, look at the housing market with empathy. I mean, I really do see that from where you sit makes just a huge difference in all this. And I think I know plenty of people my age who, I kind of said this before, it's unfair generationally. We were able, people my age were able to buy a house, and, your housing costs at that point, you got a lot of control over that. Most people here, probably 70, 80% of our neighbors don't have that. And if we don't have it in our family, we're going to have it. So when what does it mean to have the average rent of $3,000 a month? I mean, look at it with an empathy lens.
Yeah. I've often been told what looks like somebody else's problem today is going to be yours tomorrow.
One thing I would say is join your neighborhood association, because those neighborhood associations are really critical to what happens in your neighborhood. And if you're a person who would support more housing, that is a way to really engage at the grassroots level and help Dan and others as they're bringing their projects forward. So that's one thing I would say. The other is that in every city and in the county, they all have housing commission. Those are something you can apply to get involved. You can weigh in and make sure that your voice is heard. And then I would say there are lots of organizations, whether it's Destination Home or our Housing Trust or All Home, that if you want to make a contribution, like a financial contribution, get on their newsletters, become part of these communities, there's a way to do that. And we really, really could use your help. And I know a lot of folks who tune in are already doing volunteer work through their churches or their communities to make sure that people are fed and clothed. And this is an extension of that very good work you're doing, and just asking people to bump it up a little bit so that we really can I think, end homelessness in our communities. Like I actually have confidence that if we can get everybody engaged, rowing at least generally in the same direction, we're going to get to resolve this.
Absolutely. I would just close by saying, say yes to housing. If you're at your dinner table and somebody's asking you, did you hear about this new development that's happening down the street? I'm a little nervous because the formerly home. Say yes. If you hear about a market rate project happening downtown because the workers down there need it, say yes. We need housing at all income levels in order to meet the needs of our community. And I think if you're nervous, turn that frustration into action. You can absolutely say yes, even in casual conversation, or you can call in to your boards of supervisors or your city council members and say yes, because we need an all in, all yes, and a yes and sort of approach to how we tackle this issue. And then the last thing I'd say, Fred, is just there are a ton of smart lay people out there who give a damn about their communities. Just see beyond the people in front of you and understand that there's so much more going on. We've been talking about the intersectional nature of everything that touches our lives as we sit in our own seats, affect other people in different ways. Understanding that when you're trying to understand this crisis and bringing that empathy and compassion to the table.
So Dan, Cindy, Tamika, thank you so much for being with us today. But more importantly, thank you so much for being part of the solution. We appreciate you being with us today. We appreciate the work that you are doing. Before going, if you are still listening, make sure you check the chat box in the YouTube channel to look at some of the resources that have been offered there, additional reading, additional materials, all that kind of stuff. And again, from the San Francisco Foundation, thank you to our Bay Area Leads donors for making all of this possible. I'm Fred Blackwell, CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, and this program is now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Fred.
you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.